director of the Watauga Residential College at Appalachian State University. We have 3 presentations that we're going to be able to see, and again, let me pull them up. So what we'll do is we'll just go in order. So it'll be Keven White presenting on Jesus the Rebel, and then Rachel Crawford, Narrative Identity, Authority and Religion in Game of Thrones, and then Claire Tuffy, The Cultural Politics of Libby Holman's 1932 Indictment for Murder. I've usually found in these kinds of presentations, if we just go through them and you sort of be ready to ask questions at the end, that's usually the best way to do it. So, Kevin?
Cool, thank you, Clark. Yeah, I'm Kevin. I think I've introduced myself to everybody in the room. But yeah, I'm a little nervous, so we'll see how this goes. But yeah, so I'm presenting on Jesus the Rebel. It's a paper I wrote last semester for my critical theory and biblical text class. And we're going to explore this guy's book, James Scott, Domination and the Arts of Resistance. He writes on these things called the hidden and public transcript, and we're going to kind of apply his theories to the Gospel of Mark. And just specifically the Gospel of Mark, not looking at anything else beyond that. So we'll start by kind of looking at his theories and then kind of apply them to the Bible as we go. So the public transcript and the deceptions of the dominant. The public transcript, as he defines it, is a shorthand way of describing the open interaction between subordinates and those who dominate. Public being what can be observed by the opposite party, and then the transcript being the complete record of what took place. So in ancient Israel, in 1st century Palestine, that would be the Jewish rulers who were kind of puppets of Rome. Obviously, Rome had control of this area at the time, and they were kind of using the high priest of the temple to kind of dominate everything and to tax the people. And a lot of this was done through the apparatus of the temple, where people would come to sacrifice for the forgiveness of sins, as Jewish ideology kind of allowed that to happen. Let's see, so the dominant class had the most influence in the public, obviously, because they had the power. However, they were the minority group. They weren't the majority. So majority were peasants, farmers, salespeople, just your everyday Joe. But they obviously, the people in power had the wealth, so they kind of had control. They also had the military on their side as well. So they could control materials. They were often taxed the people at outrageous rates. They obviously forced them to be subordinate because they had no choice. If the military is ruling everything, you really can't do anything about that. And then they could ideologically justify the inequality. So through the temple, which there's a picture there in the lower corner. Obviously, that's a conception because the temple's no longer here. But they could justify taxing the peasants through, okay, so if they came to the temple, they'd pay taxes to sacrifice there, and then that would allow them to mitigate sins, so kind of they're paying for their salvation in that sense. So the temple is really where all of this power kind of fluctuated through. And then they had the appearance of unity. Obviously, there wasn't, you see that in Mark, where we'll just say the author's name is Mark, but where Mark kind of observes them as you see the priests sometimes debating on what to do about Jesus, or kind of debating about what path to take. We got to get rid of this dude. We don't exactly know how to do it. So that kind of fluctuates there. But they have to maintain this appearance of unity. Otherwise, they appear weak, and that kind of gives the subordinate, the peasants, the oppressed people, an opportunity to rise up and kind of target that lack of unity, if that makes sense. So hidden transcript and resistance of the subordinate. So the hidden transcript is, as Scott describes it, discourse that takes place off stage beyond the direct observation of power holders. So basically you have, the people in power at the temple and kind of mostly in Jerusalem, but places that would be off stage would be these little villages in Galilee, and just kind of around Jerusalem and kind of out in the suburbs where, in a rural area where they just wouldn't have the manpower to be able to rule and kind of observe that. Does that make sense? Yeah. And also in Jerusalem, places and houses, referencing Acts, you often see a lot of the early churches started off in houses, in small little houses. And those are kind of little areas, little subtle areas that the people in power could not observe what was happening there. So often they were in little hidden areas, hence hidden transcript. So there was a specific presence of the social space where they could kind of represent themselves freely. They wouldn't have to worry about observation of those in power, and they could just kind of be themselves and kind of do whatever they want. In this case, worship Jesus, which was kind of seen as a rebellion, an act of rebellion in that time. Meaningful challenges of power kind of varied. It kind of depended on what was going on. Often they would attack power, hiddenly. They would kind of use irony. They would use sarcastic remarks, things that the people in power really couldn't pick up on, things that were kind of obviously hidden because they didn't have the chance to start a revolt and try and fight those who were governing, because they would get smashed. They would get destroyed. Active nature of sustainability. So in order for the hidden transcript to remain active, they obviously had to be sustainable about it, because there's constantly people oppressing them and trying to find out ways to get rid of their ideology and kind of remove them from any sense of power, even though they're already subordinates. So they had to remain active. They had to remain very dedicated to what they were doing. Otherwise, it would fall through. It just wouldn't work. And then function as a coping mechanism. So obviously, if you're being oppressed, you need space where you can express yourself freely again. And that was a way for them to get by. They could mock those in power without them being aware of it. It was just kind of a way for those who were subordinate to kind of, take a stab at those in power without risking their own lives in that regard. There's just a picture of like a dude with some sheep. I don't know, I just found it on the internet. But so now kind of applying it more to first century Palestine. There's a map there, but obviously, so you got Jerusalem somewhere there, and so you got Egypt down here. You've got Rome up to the west north, and then you've also got the rest of Mesopotamia and over to the east. So this area of Palestine, which is kind of what the Romans came to call it, which made up like Judea and Galilee and Samaria and all this area, became like a major trade route. So obviously, it's kind of makes sense why people would want to rule this area, and you see that all throughout the Hebrew Bible, where the Israelites are in power for a pretty minority amount of the time, and then constantly they're being overtaken by other kingdoms, by other rulers, the Babylonians, a bunch of people coming in and just taking over that area, because it was a high route of trade, constantly things going through there, and they could make a lot of money off of it. Very wealthy area. And at this time, obviously, the Romans ruled this area during Jesus' time. So tribute, as Herzog defines it, is an economic expression of domination. And tribute more is like taxation, basically, like I said, that goes through the temple. And because they could justify it with religion, they could tax the people basically at whatever rate they wanted. Because if you want to be saved, you're going to pay what you can for that to happen, especially people who were uneducated. They weren't even allowed to receive an education, obviously, and just suppressed in multiple ways. Difficult for peasants to maintain their existence again. That ideology could be justified by using religion, by using Judaism at the time to justify the impoverishment of the common person. And then obviously, like I said, the wealthy imperialist elite were the minority versus the majority impoverished peasantry, who are obviously unaware of the power that they hold as the majority, but they would still have to face it against the army, which is obviously better trained and better armed in that sense. And then Callahan references something that's really interesting, is that the Israelites, out of every people that the Romans occupied, they revolted the most out of any people, and you can kind of see that again in the history of the Israelites if you look into the Hebrew Bible, where their ideology kind of states like, hey, we're not going to be ruled by anyone, we're going to be ruled by God. We're not going to let anyone else rule over us. And you kind of see that whenever the Northern Kingdom and Southern Kingdom split, differences in ideology there, and because there was high taxation again, and suppression and oppression of the common person, because they were constructing the temple at high cost to the people. But yeah, so they have this history of not wanting to be ruled, and the most successful rebellion post the destruction of the monarchies was the Maccabean rebellion, which lasted for just lasted for a couple hundred years, but then they got smashed, of course. So now, applying this to Mark, here's my thesis. I'll just read it off real fast. By using Scott's concept of the hidden transcript, we can reveal the Christology within the Gospel of Mark to be the ultimate manifestation of indignant resistance toward the ruling elite. That's a lot. I don't even know what that means, so I'm just kidding. But yeah, so looking at Mark, obviously Mark was the first written gospel, but it appears second in the canon. It's interesting because it's written from like a subordinate ideology, because at the time Christianity was not the majority but the minority, so they were an oppressed people, but it becomes part of a canon of a tradition that becomes the majority and that becomes in power throughout history. So that's kind of an interesting perspective to have. And then, so yeah, I think that's pretty much everything for that slide. Now looking at the character of Jesus in Mark. Mark's one of the three synoptics, Mark, Matthew, and Luke. John's pretty different from the rest of them, but Jesus in Mark is specifically unique, and it all functions kind of around this concept of the messianic secret, where Jesus, his identity is very questionable. People ask him, "Who are you?" And he responds ambiguously. He'll ask the disciples, and I have it down there, who do you say I am? Who do people say I am? And they kind of go through all these different scenarios. There's a big sense of ambiguity, because when Jesus performs miracles, people often don't pick up on it. They're like, what's going on here? And he'll kind of say, hey, keep it secret, don't tell anyone. I want this to be very secretive. And that's very unique to the Gospel of Mark. And that's often been an interesting point, because in that Gospel, it's like, well, what's Jesus trying to do? If he's the Messiah, if he's claiming to be the Messiah, and he's trying to be secretive about it, what's actually going on there, you know? And then again in the parables, you see this all the time, where he'll present a parable, everyone gets confused, Jesus walks away with the disciples, and the disciples are like, what's going on? And he'll explain it to them, he'll kind of be like, y'all are stupid, why don't y'all get this? But he never explains it to the peasants. So like, they don't exactly understand what's going on, the disciples barely understand what's going on, and that's what kind of creates, in my opinion, this triple layer of the hidden transcript, where you have, on the far outside, you have the peasants, the priests, who are like, well, I have no idea, like, what the hell's going on with Jesus, you know? And then you've got the disciples who kind of have an idea, but they're still figuring it out. And then you've got Jesus here in the middle, who's the only person who actually knows, like, what's going on. And then again, the miracles were pretty secretive as well. And then so, jumping to the Passion narrative, when he gets to Jerusalem, is when the climax really hits. And there's a big change in his political discourse. Where like Scott kind of calls this transition the speaking truth to power, where this is the first time you see him being very vocal with the priests, being very vocal with the peasants, and he kind of has this sense of immunity, because the public supports him at this point. Word of his miracles have gotten out, and his teachings, and they're like, oh, this dude must be the Messiah. So if you recall, if you read the Bible, when he arrives to Jerusalem, you know, they're all like laying, the little palm leaves down on the ground, and they're welcoming him there. And the reason I think that Jesus was so secretive about his identity was because previously these concepts of the Messiah was this rebellious, violent leader who was going to come and wipe out Rome. But Jesus obviously does not use violence, because clearly in the past they'd all been destroyed, so that just wouldn't have been successful. And then, so like a lot of these encounters are very public at this point, because he has the support. So you have the encounter where he's like, the temple's going to be destroyed. He has that whole issue about taxes with the priest, where they're like, who do we pay to, Jesus, or do we pay to God, or do we pay to Caesar? And he responds kind of smart alecky there. So there's a lot of encounters there. And he goes to the temple and flips tables and does all this crazy stuff. And that's kind of the climax of Jesus' hidden transcript. And then, so in conclusion, this whole thing kind of wraps around the concept of Jesus' death on the cross. And the reason that is, the ideology that comes out of that is because when he dies, this concept of him being the ultimate sacrifice to mitigate sins becomes very relevant in the gospel, and obviously in Christianity's history, because that's what the whole religion revolves around. And the reason that this kind of reveals the hidden transcript is because people can now go to Jesus to mitigate sins rather than the temple. Does that make sense? Because see, the temple was where all the oppression was coming from, because they were taxing people, they were forcing them to do all these things, and that's where all the ideological power was. Now they could go to a different power without violence, but more of a mental, psychological form of rebellion by following Jesus to mitigate sins. And that's all I have time for. But yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, okay, cool.
Okay then, and hopefully we'll get Rachel's up. Do you have your